word of mouth is the strongest advertising channel. No one, I think, wanted to always like admit that because you couldn't really advertise on word of mouth. That's essentially what influencer marketing is there in a way. You know, people are highly influenced by people they follow. If you haven't yet woken up and understood that this is no longer just about user level data tracking and it's about understanding people, understanding demographics, understanding audiences, thinking like a marketer, time to wake up.
All right. Hello, everyone. So welcome to this week's episode of Matchmate Talks. I'm your host, Petteri, and today we are talking about attribution, which definitely isn't the simplest topic, to say the least. And to discuss with me today, I have Maor Sadra, the CEO and co-founder of Incrmntl, which is an incrementality measurement platform for advertisers. And welcome to the show, Maor. Glad to have you here.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me.
All right, great to have you here. But before we go into the subject matter, could you introduce yourself briefly to our viewers?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Maor, as you said. I've been in the marketing technology space for a little bit more than 20 years now. So a while, I would say. I've started on the desktop days and then made the switch to mobile when mobile was pretty much like starting to grow very fast. I worked at companies like Interactive, which was a supply-side platform acquired by Fiber, and then I moved to Berlin to join a company called Uplift. I would say that I've always been fairly opinionated on the topic of measurement, but it wasn't like until I was at Uplift that I became extremely opinionated on this topic. And yeah, in 2020, the midst of the pandemic, I decided, okay, now is the time for me to fix this, and started Incrmntl with a co-founder. And yeah, the company is now scaling up, like 20 plus people, hiring a bunch of people. So if you know anyone, solving measurements problems for companies across various verticals and screens and sizes and so on.
Excellent. Sounds really, really good. And definitely send your applications Maor's way if this sounds interesting to you. But yeah, I mean, I guess we can then start digging into the measurement topic itself. But if we start from like the very basic level of things. So anyone who's worked in the online marketing space is familiar with Google Analytics and these simpler attribution tools. The principle there is really, really simple, right? You add some parameters to a link, and once a person clicks that on an ad or somewhere else, then the platform kind of tells you, hey, this traffic was generated from this source and so on. So that's pretty straightforward, but it doesn't really tell you the whole truth and doesn't really answer all of those different business needs. So maybe you could start from kind of, what are the issues related to this simple solution, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so if we really, really go back to kind of like when digital marketing started and so on, the dream was there, okay? And actually, in principle, if I could understand what you did, okay, as a customer, as a user, okay, if I can actually know that you've seen this ad and you've been exposed to that ad and you've passed through this billboard, and I could actually like even know that you follow a certain influencer. Like, let's say if I could really know all of this data points, in theory, the concept of like user level tracking as a measurement solution would be awesome, okay? But let's go a little bit to the other side. Do you as a user really want companies to know that much information about you?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. And yeah, I would say traditionally, while the dream was always this like multi-touch attribution, that was the dream of a lot of companies, including myself, to be fair. It actually didn't really pan that way because of user privacy, user restrictions, and so on. Even before, Apple made their change like last year, even before that, more than 30% of users were like opting out of like user level tracking. So what a lot of companies did was, let's go for the simpler solution, which is what is called last touch attribution. Okay, user clicked this ad last before buying this car. We're just going to attribute this ad to the user buying the car, which also doesn't really make sense. But then when he started thinking of like other mediums, okay, influencers, television, and so on, obviously they influence users, but users don't necessarily have something to click on or just don't click because like they've seen a video. Why would they click? So obviously the whole concept of last search attribution or last click attribution didn't really answer the needs of the marketers to actually measure all marketing, okay? And I think that's kind of like where Incrmntl started. That was the problem. That was the problem that bothered me all these years, that like user level tracking as a means of attribution or as a means of measurement wasn't really cutting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is definitely something we see with our clients as well. You know, of course, working with influencers, that's just one video-based medium. And, you know, more and more of the online content, like you said, is getting consumed through video. And in most of those, you know, the natural behavior of the person simply isn't to click out to, you know, an online store, app store, anything like this to, you know, do conversions, right? If you're watching YouTube videos on your mobile phone or Instagram stories or TikToks or anything, the default behavior is you know, to watch another piece of content and so on, right? So I mean, it will impact you for sure. Like you said, you know, if you're buying a car, ads are going to have an effect on you, but it's not going to be the last ad you click on that made you decide on that single car. Or, you know, if you see a nice video, it can impact your decision, but you're not going to, in at least for the vast majority of the cases, you're not going to click out there and then to book a test drive and so on. Like it happens somewhere down the line. So definitely, you know, that's one thing that these traditional platforms aren't really solving. And I think another example I think you touched upon as well is, you know, linear television, for example, or any other offline medium. Of course, if you can provide some sort of personalized link or something like this, you can attribute it to some extent, but like these digital attribution solutions simply don't handle that very well. But anyone who's ever done a TV campaign knows that it can work extremely well for you. But if your attribution says, you know, I mean, it will show up as like direct traffic or something, or organic searches or something like this. So how do you conclude that it's working? So definitely some kind of better solutions are you know, needed in to account for these scenarios, and more of those are going to be needed going forward. Like you said, Apple is restricting tracking already. Google is thinking of doing something similar in the upcoming years. So you know, this is going to get even more and more challenging in the future.
It's funny that like most of the solutions, like in the last, I would say, decade, when it came to like newer mediums, okay, and influencers is there, we're still thinking about it from the user standpoint. Means let's stick a QR code in front of the user, okay? And you know what? For sure, some percent of the users will like use the QR code. Not necessarily if you're using your phone to watch the influencer, you might not click the QR code. That doesn't make sense. But again, some percent of the users will do that. And again, it's kind of like trying to squeeze user level tracking to measure a medium that shouldn't necessarily be like measured on a user level scenario, because again, it's like, I think the behavior here, when you think of the actual like user, okay, watching a video, hearing from someone they like about, I don't know, if it's a game or a product that like would likely be like interesting for them, they're likely not going to take an immediate action. And often what we end up seeing, or what I think most marketers will see, is that, let's say you advertise on television, okay, which is like, you know, pretty big medium. You're going to see indeed a lot more conversions attributed in social, in search, and so on. Now, essentially, what caused these users to convert? Was it the search or was it the television? Where do you divert your budget? So I think at the end of the day, it's kind of like the whole concept of user level like tracking drove a lot of marketers to make very, very, very bad decisions when it came to budget allocation. Essentially saying, well, if, you know, this influencer is generating 1/10 of the conversions that I'm getting from, I don't know, this random ad network, I'm just going to like use the random ad network rather than the influencer, not realizing that like on that front, the attribution data you're getting was only showing you a really, really, really small part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this can also be backed up by some consumer and buyer behavior research that I've seen, which talks about, vast majority of US adults, for example, I think the figure is almost 60 to 70%, mention that they have bought products, that they have seen influencers talk about. But if you look at the digital attribution of it, like it's never going to show up in those kinds of numbers. So definitely, definitely agreed.
Yeah, and by the way, there was like, I think, an era within digital marketing, which is not that old. Let's remember, it's like a bit more than 2 decades. An era of data obsession means it doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what I believe, it doesn't matter what I've learned as a marketer. If the data shows me I'm getting all conversions from this channel, I'm just going to divert all conversions to this, all budgets to that channel, which, like, I think right now, thanks to, again, like the changes caused by privacy regulations, a lot of marketers need to essentially go back to basics, to asking the question, like, where is my audience? And by the way, it's like, I think we've always known this, as word of mouth is the strongest advertising channel. No one, I think, wanted to always like admit that, because you couldn't really advertise on word of mouth. That's essentially what influencer marketing is there in a way. People are highly influenced by people they follow. And there is an almost intimate relationship between followers and influencers. And if an influencer tells you this is a product you like because I like it, the likelihood of you converting is significantly higher than you seeing just an ad out of place, out of context.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think like this covers the challenge pretty well, right? So, we have a ton of different marketing channels. People behave in them in different ways. They probably all have an impact, but with the traditional attribution solutions, this can be hard or to measure or impossible in some cases, which will lead, some channels to looking better than they actually are. But I guess then we kind of get to the question of what can be done to address this, right? So I've certainly seen something like Facebook, for example, offers these conversion lift studies where you can look at, how much does it actually contribute, how much does the advertising actually contribute to your sales overall, for example. But it requires you to have very big budgets to kind of get strong enough results from this. There's also things like organic uplift estimates where you can estimate different kinds of, if you run a big influencer campaign on YouTube, for example, then see how your organic traffic changes and estimate it through that. So there are these different kinds of methodologies of, how you can potentially address this, because I think at the end of the day, we can't live completely without data, and we can't be completely rely on qualitative insights. So, what can we do there, essentially?
Yeah. So maybe I want to first explain what is conversion lift studies versus what is called brand lift or geo lift studies. So conversion lift studies is all about dividing audience, in half, doesn't matter. But let's assume you show half the users an ad and half the users you don't show an ad. And essentially what you want to compare is the users exposed to ads convert more than the users who don't, Now, if an influencer had the ability to, in a way, A/B test a video, half the users will see my video but without mentioning of any product, and half the users will see the video with. Actually, that would have been, in a way, a very, very strong method of an influencer proving to a brand, this is the value I'm generating for you. But that's not, at least now, a feature that I think by any other platform.
I think so.
So that's pretty much out of the question. We came to conversion lift studies, by the way, because you need to divide audiences, and now we're talking about audience targeting and so on. It's pretty much dead on iOS, at least, and it's dying on Android and Google devices, or basically browsers in general. Now, GeoLift test or holdout test, which is the other approach, is why don't you turn off advertising and then turn on advertising and compare the difference? Now, effectively, you would think that this is a good approach, but the average marketer at scale is running like usually a lot of channels, and seasonality plays a very strong part. Means you cannot really compare performance in October, November, December, January. It's just so in a way, it's often a method that marketers will test. Like, I'm going to turn you on and I'm going to turn you off, and I'm going to look at the difference. There you need the before and after to be very clear. So means either you are running in a market where you have nothing else, in order to be able to compare the before and after, or you are really spending at scale, means with a very large influencer, risking the budgets by essentially turning campaigns on and off to compare the difference. Now, the other challenge when it comes to influencer marketing, you have no control on where users will be exposed. So let's say if it's a French-speaking influencer, you're going to be relatively confined to French-speaking markets. But if it's an English-speaking market or influencer, performance might come like anywhere. Okay, and if your product is available anywhere, then it's really, really, really hard to actually know where is this affecting, who is this affecting. So you have methodologies like exit surveys, like, hey, how did you hear about our product? And some percent of the users will be happy to fill it and say, yeah, I've seen a video, I've heard about you in a video, which is a good data point. And I think that's kind of like, in a way, what marketers have been doing in order to measure exit surveys, asking users. I think the smart marketers knew how to not take any data point as exact. Means this is a proxy, okay? If a certain percent of users are telling me I've got to your product because I've seen it in an ad by an influencer, it's usually a good enough data point to tell you there is an effect, okay? How much is the effect? Then we get to kind of like advanced algorithms, which is a little bit more what Incrmntl does.
Absolutely, and we can dig into those methods in a bit. But I think, like you mentioned, influencers or YouTubers, for example, are a bit of a special case, because obviously there is a kind of targeting if you sponsor a creator, in that they know who their audience is, typically where it sort of comes from, but it's not quite as exact as ad targeting, which, as you mentioned, now is going away as well. But I think a great example of what you mentioned is that, for example, if you want to target people in the UK with influencer campaigns, that is actually very challenging, because a huge majority of influencers in the UK or YouTubers in the UK is actually watched by English speakers around the globe, US and elsewhere as well. So, it does get very tricky in these situations, whereas in ads, you can still do the kind of geo limiting or geo targeting a bit more precisely. But yeah, that's an excellent point, that it does get, especially with influencers, it does get a bit more tricky in some of these scenarios. And I already kind of shortly touched upon sort of the organic uplift. So that's one approach we've seen some customers use, that when they run these very large influencer campaigns where they hire, dozens of YouTubers, for example, what they typically see is they get an uplift on, if it's, let's say it's a mobile app advertiser, they typically see uplift in the organic searches and organic app store installs. So once you've run those kinds of campaigns, you can then look at how much your organic traffic increases from the baseline and do some estimates from there. So there are kind of these creative ways you can generate these insights. But yeah, it is definitely a kind of tricky problem to account for in many situations.
The challenge is that the whole attribution logic behind the scenes is obviously completely intransparent. Means that, let's say again, you've done a massive influencer campaign with 24 influencers, all touching your user audience base. Maybe your organics remain flat, but actually where you see suddenly a lot more conversions is Facebook is working better. I'm seeing a lot more conversions. Exactly. Now, again, you have the Facebook or the social marketing manager says, I've swapped creative. All of this additional value came because of my job. Influencers did nothing. It's really, really hard because, again, it's like you don't see the funnel. You don't know really what influence your users. And honestly speaking, again, going from the privacy standpoint, I don't want any company knowing anything about my my entire search history and habits and so on. And it's enormous amounts of data that are really unnecessary in order to do something as simple as measuring performance.
Exactly. And yeah, I guess that's kind of where we get to the point that, we need to increasingly move away from the user level, if to think of other solutions. And I think you already mentioned, this is definitely something you guys are specializing in at Incrmntl. So maybe you can talk a bit about how you approach this problem more specifically.
Yeah, so I would say that Incrmntl doesn't really have necessarily a view over a screen. Means from our perspective, the inputs data we get from customers is the total number of, let's say, installs, first purchases, revenue, whatever they want to measure. Okay, and then there's the ad spends, which often will include influencer spends. Then for us, the most important thing is the marketing changes customers do. Means the small day-to-day operational changes. Pausing a campaign, starting a campaign, increasing beats, swapping creatives, launching influencers, pausing influencers, the changes they do. And essentially when a customer comes and says, I want to measure what is the value I got by running influencer campaigns in, I don't know, whatever countries, then essentially what, from a methodology standpoint, we're doing is we're now overlaying the customer's own seasonality data. Means how does your installs look like in whatever country on weekends and weekdays and holidays and special days, a month of the year, and basically, is there any trends? Okay, then we basically look at every other marketing activity they do, every other campaign increase, pause, start, budgets, any other channels they're operating in, to create a prediction that essentially answers a simple question. I say simple. What would have happened if you didn't make this change? So this is an area within algorithms and data science that is called causal data science. Essentially, it comes to build a prediction of what would have happened if you didn't make a change. The difference between what actually happened to what could have happened or what would have happened, that is essentially the value. Now, when you run this methodology, essentially on large sets of data, total number of conversions in a country or total number of conversions within multiple countries, language, let's take language, then you start seeing really interesting things. And that allows us to essentially give I would say, much more realistic and fair measurement for whatever you're measuring, whether if it's out of home or influencers or television and so on. So that's kind of the gist of the methodology. I think what is specifically difficult when it comes to influencer spend is like a label, okay? But there are many types of influencer marketing and how an influencer will incorporate the brand. You have an influencer whose channel is about, let's say, Clash of Clans, okay, the game. So everything they do is influencing people. And you have an influencer which will mention a specific product, like what was it, a snuggly blanket. I'm mentioning that specifically because my 9-year-old son, for him, television is YouTube. Okay. Yeah. He only watches YouTube. Mm-hmm. And when he came to me saying that he wants me to buy him a snuggly blanket, I was like, what? Because his favorite influencer was saying that this blanket is super cool and very comfortable and so on. So, so it's influencer marketing is a much broader term than what people will sometimes think of, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and maybe I think a couple of things. So for an advertiser who's kind of looking to understand their channels a bit better, I think there were a couple of takeaways, at least I heard from that. So before you go into the very more advanced solutions and software and so on, but couple of key things I would definitely pick from there is that have a change log, right? So understand what you are doing in different channels and when. And have it kind of shared across the marketing organization, because then different people can have inputs on it. There's never going to be only one person responsible for all of the activations you're running. So developing that to understand what different parts of the organization are doing and how that can potentially affect your performance. I think that's a good takeaway for any marketer. And then you mentioned the seasonality as well. I think this is something in some businesses it is stronger, in others it's less there, let's say. But definitely also kind of comparing results based on how that typically behaves. I guess now during the pandemic, it's also been more challenging because like the old seasonality trends have shifted so much in different industries, and maybe they will go now back more towards the normal, but I don't know how comparable it is right now if you look at like older data from before. But at least those two I think are quite good insights for any advertiser looking to understand their channels better in this sense.
Yeah, I would still add, by the way, again, adding the unique URL, adding the exit survey. It doesn't replace, but it's a good data point. Okay, and again, it's like you cannot just trust blindly the data to the point of the data obsession era, where you just make very hard decisions based on. That's kind of like definitely what I would say. I think one of the other biggest challenges currently with influencers is because it's such a broad term. Okay, there's so much types of marketing with influencers. There's no standardization of pricing other than supply versus demand. Means if I'm a popular influencer, someone's willing to offer me, I don't know, 50K per post, I'm not going to price to the next advertiser at 10,000. So I would say supply and demand kind of like dictates market behavior and market trends. There is a fact that influencer marketing works. Measurability of it, that's a challenge of its own. And yeah, I hope more companies use Incrmntl to solve their problems. But like there are other solutions available to at least understand that this is an extremely important medium to essentially crack.
Yeah, and that's actually something, the pricing I think is a definitely an interesting topic, and that's something where we are helping a lot of clients with, not to not to advertise too much during this discussion, but that's definitely something where we help clients a lot, because manually price negotiating is one of the bigger hurdles in influencer marketing, and that affects the performance too. It's kind of twofold. If you're a very big influencer, you have a lot of bargaining power on the pricing and how you should be pricing. But definitely if you're a smaller content creator, you probably don't know how you should be pricing certain things. Or if you're an advertiser, you might not always have an idea like how much should I be offering for this influencer because he has audience in different countries. How big of a portion is in a specific country? That's going to be more valuable to me if he has more US users, for example, and less valuable if it's from another country, and so on. So definitely doing more kind of database pricing and doing it more automatically and at bigger scale across the channel is something that's going to help with this. And I think at the other side of the equation is kind of, once you are able to more accurately also measure the impact of influencers as a channel, maybe to some extent, the impact of an individual creator, but also, if you're doing, let's say you're doing YouTube sponsorships. So if you're able to estimate YouTube sponsorships as a whole, like better see what kind of revenue impact they are actually having, that can then also lead you to be able to price things better and value the conversions you are getting from that channel better, and so on. So it will then kind of improve the situation from both sides, if you will.
Yeah. By the way, I used to think that, like, if you think about it, like marketers 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they didn't have the amount of data that we have these days. The world was a little bit less complex, which was in a way a nice thing. And I actually think that the privacy compliance regulations, whatever, take us there, which is like not a bad thing. Of course, we live in a much more complicated and complex world with technology, like mostly I would say improving our capabilities. We can enjoy both worlds, which is, I think, where we are today.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think one important thing to remember is that even if the analytics is not able to track the change, like the behavior that people do, the people are still behaving in a certain way, right? So they haven't changed their habits overnight, even if you can no longer attribute something to a specific channel. So at the end of the day, it should always be about the people. And I think, with the privacy regulations, it will help us move more towards that in some ways as well.
Yeah, agree.
But yeah, I think that was kind of the main topics we had to discuss. But maybe if you had to give any other tips to marketers thinking about, how should they go about improving this measurement, or how to better understand, the effectiveness of the marketing. What's a good place to get started? We kind of dove deep into all of these different methods already, but if you were to summarize the learnings a little bit, maybe what would be your top highlights around this?
I think first of all, it's again coming like understanding expectations. If you're a marketer and let's say you're not now using Incrmntl and you don't have advanced data science models and you're just trying to kind of like see if it works. For sure, the questions or the hypothesis you need to come up with and the way to kind of like measure that needs to be aligned. Means you really just want to get a couple of like sample from the new customers you're winning. Have you seen it? Or asking the question differently, like which YouTube channels are you subscribed on, or what do you like to see? Trying to essentially just understand, is this affecting? And most of the time the answer will be yes. But I think if you're coming to influencer marketing immediately expecting to see, I don't know, like 20-cent cost per install or whatever you're getting from certain like down funnel trackable mediums, you're not going to get it.
Exactly.
And in a way, it's like going back, and if you haven't yet woken up and understood that this is no longer just about user level data tracking, and it's about understanding people, understanding demographics, understanding audiences, thinking like a marketer, time to wake up.
I think that's an excellent summary, and maybe one additional learning I would highlight from my side. So like you said, getting those learnings, and I think this is where a lot of the companies whose product is geared towards consumers are not using it enough, because I think on B2B it's more common to ask these, where did you hear about us, do these user surveys, but it's not limited to only that. If you're doing mobile games or mobile apps, any kind of consumer software, anything like this, an e-com store, you can easily do these kinds of questionnaires there as well. And I think this is something that a lot of the B2C marketers are still overlooking. So definitely, if you have a consumer-oriented product, start doing this there as well.
Yeah, especially by the way with your core audiences, with the users who really, really are into it. And if we think gaming, the users who reached, I don't know, any level above 10,000 on Candy, they really, really like the product, okay? And they would be willing to tell you, like, about themselves. Maybe not all of them, but the some who do, that's insights. That's essentially where you need to be placing your product. That's where you need to be advertising.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that's about it for this week's episode, and it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us, Maor, and for anyone watching, please leave your comments below. Would love to hear your thoughts on what you thought about our discussion. And until next time, and thank you so much, Maor, and see you later.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.